Oh, for real? Oh, well, you're just introducing yourself. Okay. And today we have a special guest, famous Twitter user, yungneocon.
Sorry, you broke off completely, so I don't know who I am anymore. Yeah.
We're doing
hi.
pretty good.
I'm
off to a late
Chris.
start. Partly because, it's, it's half of your fault, maybe 80% your fault. But
hey, everybody. All right, how are you?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So today we wanted to.
I'm totally willing to accept
we actually
the
wanted to do this
responsibility
episode several weeks ago.
It's all because you don't
there were
with your
scheduling
bed.
conflicts, but Young Neocon
Not just my
had
bed. Anyway,
a little bit of a dog pile on him about a tweet thread he made in response to the idea that Soviet central planning was a good way to deal with climate change, and it blew up pretty big, I think, and so we wanted to talk about that today.
It's like not, the thread itself didn't blow up. I mean, what blew up was the screenshot I did of it that was like making fun of myself, right? So I tweeted something like it was like, who would have thought that this would have ended this way? Like, the point being that obviously,
I thought I remember people getting mad because you were
like everybody
took it stuff to a woman.
As me saying like the opposite. They're like, maybe because you're a social dumbass, da 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 da. And I'm like, yeah, that was the point of the tweet.
Okay.
I'm just like, I don't know, but.
Yeah, it was very weird because there was a dog pile that resulted in everyone
that was
being
one
nice
of the things that came up later.
Apologizing later, which is so rare.
One of the people who said that later apologized for it too. So it's just like because
That's a good mufo.
Very rare, yeah.
I suspect that one of my mufos actually did it behind my said something to them. That's my guess. That's my guess as to what happened. I think a garbage Twitter person did it. I think so. I think so. I don't know. I have my suspicions as to who it is, but it doesn't matter. Actually, the whole thing was ironic too because everybody was just shitting on that tweet and being really mean and being like, "Oh no, stupid dipshit" or whatever. So I was just like. I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to respond to it, even though I know it's a joke. I just it probably will be blocked as a result of this. But I was just like, I don't think that this person is stupid, so I don't want to treat them like they're stupid. And so then I answered that way, and then just it had the opposite effect. So all the people who did do the tweets that were like, "Oh, you're a stupid dipshit" or whatever, they didn't get any flack. but then I did. It was just kind of, weird, and then
later nothing in that thread was very. I haven't
I was doing the hey dipshit thing, and because she blocked a lot of people, and then later when she found out that I actually answered, is when she unblocked me.
Saying stuff.
And
okay. But it's the kind of pissy where it's everyone.
I did get a little pissy at the end, but
really knowing.
But other than that,
it
was very considered by my standards. It's just, and there's this whole thing too. It's just, I don't know. Just I've done other threads where I've not only given page numbers or whatever, but links to PDFs or whatever.
Writing good tweets is a full time.
And I didn't have the energy and time to do that this time because that takes literally hours of work. It really does. It's really painstaking and annoying actually. But so I just did Well, no, sourcing tweets with PDFs and getting them off Skyhub and then screenshotting them and da. That's like it takes so much time. It's just like so all I did that time was just screenshot all these books or whatever. And what was funny too is I made sure that about half of the books agreed with me and half of them didn't. I was trying to be very charitable, and there kept kind of be this phenomenon of people trying to own me by saying the books weren't relevant. So one of them was by the reason the fact that you cited Kotkin shows that you is totally irrelevant to this case. I'm like, no, he has a fucking whole book written about a Soviet's effect on the environment and called Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism of Civilization, and about high throughput extraction and the creation of a new industrial civilization. And he has two,
I think part of the problem is,
when
you're on Twitter, you're on there with everyone.
Information
and
issues,
so, usually when you hear anyone talking
the economic
about
data,
the
using
environmental problems of the Soviet Union,
or whatever,
it's
it was just
dipshit shut guy who's oh, you want to do communism to solve climate change? Well, the USSR was worse with the environment than anyone else in history. So, yeah. As far as I know, they haven't doomed everyone alive to suffer to death.
Yeah, and that's just not true. So, I mean, it's no.
Yes.
I mean, they do some people, but not everybody. No, but it's just it's funny too because not to totally undercut the premise of all of this.
Right. Well, that's what I was getting at.
As we were saying before the show,
you usually hear that type of guy that's just your enemy straight
so
up.
It's my own views on
things
this
that
are actually much more
that you were saying in the thread, but you obviously are more informed about it. So naturally you have an aversion to anyone saying that because you're just fuck off. Capitalism is way worse. What are you talking about? That's just what people assume. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
right.
Right, but it's but I always try to concede that stuff right away. So in that thread, I said literally began by saying, obviously capitalism is worse. Yes, Cuba has some great achievements. Yes, China's putting an investment into green infrastructure. Yes, the Soviet Union was not this. It was not. I mean, it wasn't an eco paradise, but it wasn't I mean, it wasn't so great for Uzbekistan. It wasn't a giant pool of floating trash of plastic, or just dead rainforests with just burning orangutans running out of it. But just
pretty much, yeah.
90% of the responses I get to my threads and stuff are people. It's the only way that their critique works is if they think that I mean I'm going to snap my fingers and make this stuff a reality overnight. But I'm not. No one can snap their fingers and end centralization overnight. So it's just it's so weird to me because one way I like to think about it is if they're right and Soviet-style central planning can do the job, then that would just come out and prove itself and it'll be moot anyway, right? Do you know what I mean? So it's I mean,
prove me wrong.
I mean, I don't want to get into the nuclear discussion depending on where y'all are, but one of my main points I make with that one, because everybody says I'm anti-nuclear when I say over and over and over, no, I support recycling. Yes, I support fourth-gen R&D. Yes, I don't think we should just take it all out right away. No, yes, I admit that it has lower deaths than coal plants. I can see that all this stuff right away, so it's not even a problem. But my point is that
my whole thing is just that it's politically toxic to try and push for nuclear. There's too much energy against it, and it's just easier to do other sources of energy, so you may as well just do those.
That's definitely true. And when I bring that political stuff up, that type of person usually dismisses it. But but my point to them though is that if we pursue, but the thing nuclear, all centralized projects, this actually relates to the central planning things, centralized projects which require huge stocks of capital and expertise and central regulation and whatever, and a large amount of land and so on and so forth. They require entire secondary infrastructure of security and logistics and sourcing and protection and regulating and training and waste disposal and so on, and making sure that lights stay on, which is actually harder than people realize, and just like all this other stuff. And it centralizes power in one area, which just definitionally makes it easier to just control from a center. It also makes it a easier target. Like, imagine if you're a capitalist and you want to subvert a revolution and they have a centralized hub. You just bomb the centralized hub and then it's over. But so there's all these issues with that. But like nuclear and like centralization, they require you to establish these huge stocks of physical capital and land. And once you do that, just as a fact, like, you have now constrained your future actions. You have prevented yourself from taking other less materially intensive options. And if it somehow fucks up, it doesn't have to fuck up, but assuming it does, it's incredibly costly to get rid of and undo. So you're locking yourself into a path-dependent outcome. But so I always say,
another big thing for me is that you need, to build the plant, you need like very highly specialized engineers that are only good for building nuclear plants. Like, nuclear engineers can't really do much else other than work on nuclear reactors.
And you need them 24/7, 365 on call.
Yeah, and as the Chernobyl series has amply demonstrated, if they get irradiated, they die. So you just have to
and then there's no more nuclear engineers in the country.
That show seems like such a double-edged sword because I was at my bar a couple weeks ago, and I found out one of the guys that I talked to there is like a Trump guy, and he's talking about Chernobyl and how it proves that socialism doesn't work. Fucking hell, dude.
Is that the takeaway? I mean, I haven't watched beyond the first 30 minutes.
That was his takeaway.
The disaster and how the people handled it, and like, there's some like poetic and dramatic liberties they've taken, as I've read. I'm only in episode 2, but there was like a fucking BBC article, right? Neolib BBC, and they're like, yeah, I mean, it's pretty good. There's some critiques that make sense. And they like talked about people who were literally there saying, yeah, it was about right, except that this guy was not a bad guy, this guy was not a bad guy. They were doing the best they could, but you had to make a fucking story out of it, right?
Of course.
And then a bunch of like, of course, our leftist Twitter garbage friends, were pretty much having like just one-off discussions about how, well, it was kind of annoying that they had to talk about America, but it was the Cold War, so I guess it was the big bad for the Soviets. Shitting on communism doesn't happen that much, so it wasn't too bad. But go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, yeah, it's just I mean, it's not like the Soviets were just like sitting around caring. I mean, they were military, but they weren't just like.
It's not like they were doing nuclear testing on their citizens, unbeknownst to them, or like injecting them with syphilis or anything like that. I actually brought that up to that guy, and I don't know how the fuck he managed to do it, but he somehow deflected it.
He just ignored it, probably.
It's like, what about the Bikini Atoll testing? And he's like, oh, well, like,
well, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that anymore.
It was necessary to invade Hiroshima, right? So, like,
man.
So, anyway, I just want to say, last quickly go nuclear things. So, it's like, my solution is always reduce waste, reduce energy use, and reduce throughput as your number one goal. Why? Because in doing so, you free up resources for whatever else you want to do. So if you want renewable energy, but you pursue renewable first strategy, you're locking yourself into something. If you pursue a waste and energy reduction strategy first, then you can still do the renewable energy, but you have more room to maneuver. And I think maybe this is a hard point to grasp, I guess, but like, it just seems like that this should be sort of obvious, that freeing up resources, reducing waste, and sort of changing our social and technological infrastructure should always be the number one priority, because whatever else we want to do, we'll be able to do even better if we do that first.
Well, I think the problem is the popular thing in environmental economics for decades now has been energy accounting. And so I think to them, adding energy is like good. So like if you were to base everything on energy accounting, I came with this. I don't know if it's a real paradox that could be named after me, but I think it should be. And but basically, like, if you go by energy accounting, the best thing to do is always to build new generators, because then you have more energy to do stuff. which means like more freedom and everything. Like all the good things that you do with energy, you get more of that by just building generators ad infinitum. And the way, of course, to resolve that is to use temporal accounting, which I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but basically you resolve everything to, a time span. So like energy-based time accounting would be you take the amount of energy that falls on the Earth in, a given amount of time, and then you would base your energy values on, that amount of time. You could take the replenishment rates of resources and then invert it to get the time value, and then you just do everything through time accounting, and that resolves the paradox. And if reducing throughput gives us more time on Earth, then that's what you do.
There is a famous paradox, the Jevons paradox. It's just, since energy is used to make energy,
mine's better.
Lower the cost of energy. No, but it's related. So if you lower the cost of
I know.
I'm just kidding. Generators, you actually induce people to use even more electricity than they would have otherwise. So that's the problem. That's why originally, this goes back 100-something years now, we had something called the Hotelling rule. Basically what it says is that the cost of finite resources should be the product of like a non-linear, like self-summating interest based on the interest rate and known available stocks. And basically the idea is the price of fixed and declining resources should never fall unless like a massive amount of them is discovered somewhere. But otherwise, because interest rates, 1% interest rate sounds small, but whatever, after 50 years, that's almost, 70% or something, and the fact of the matter is that we don't even follow anything close to the Hotelling rule. I mean, even if we just had capitalism and followed the Hotelling rule, things would be marginally better. I mean, it still wouldn't work for the long run, but just like had we had that for the last 100 years, I mean, the system would be different. Yeah. But and it's also important to note that this applies in a non-market economy too. You just you don't need to use the interest rate. You just use, as you were just saying, the temporal accounting of how much you rate the present versus the future, basically. Yep. And so, very interestingly enough, actually, the Soviet Union had implicit interest rates and shadow interest rates, as they called it. In these output analysis and linear programming analyses. And what was very interesting was that this thing that the Austrian econs talk about, which is usually just full of shit, like their whole thing about lengthening the period of production by lowering the interest rate. It's funny that the one place that actually does apply is through land intensive throughput extraction. And so the Soviet Union and the United States both had artificially low discount rates internal to firms and the government and corporations, because that's what centralized bureaucracies do. And so there's always an incentive to just a simple example, if you have a 10% sales tax, it is now 10% cheaper to become a larger company that owns both sub-companies, because now you don't have to pay, if you have a 10% sales tax or tariff, the two companies merge, you no longer have to pay that cost because it's internal to you.
Right. So, yep. Exactly.
So it encourages centralization, but then centralization that also encourages further of this, because of the fixed costs and fees of investment and risk and hiring and firing and so on. And the larger you get, the larger your assets and your flows are relative to your fixed costs, even if profit isn't rising.
Right. And also, more importantly, your market power is greater, which means you can charge higher prices and negotiate lower wages for the workers or companies that you contract with. That's
absolutely true, but even if you somehow eliminated the monopolistic pricing effects, there's other fixed cost effects would still exist, which is why.
So basically, neoclassical econ is owned thoroughly.
Well, I don't want to get too far up into the weeds on this. But, the funny thing is that the magnitude of rents and how the role land plays in the economy is actually a point of agreement across these different schools. I mean, it's Henry George, Marx, Ricardo, Marshall, Cornell, Walrus, Jevons, sort of, not the Austrians, not John Bates Clark.
The physiocrats.
The physiocrats. Well, yeah, I mean, they have a lot of other ideas, but yeah, definitely related. They don't place them in the same schema in the same way, but otherwise they basically agree on the point, which is that land's value, since it's fixed, non-produced means of production, and you have to use it in everything. It has inelastic demand. It's fixed in supply, so its value is always just going to be the function of its intensive margin, extensive margin, and absolute margin, monopoly. And and you can't, as long as you have private property and land, you have monopoly. Just because again, the fixed cost thing. So even on top of the enclosure aspect. So it's actually funny is that if you look at the formalisms of Schraffe and of ecological economics and of Henry George and of Marx, I mean, they prioritize it differently, but basically it's the same. And in neoclassical economics too, Joseph Stiglitz showed it with the Henry George theorem. So if something has the same magnitude and causal effects and analytic properties across 5 totally different models that are fundamentally opposed to each other in other ways, in general, I think that's ipso facto evidence of its validity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because if you come to the same conclusion through different analytic models, but that just,
I'm sure that a lot of them tried not to come to that conclusion.
They self-consciously did not try to. John Bates Clark and all the oil money funded people didn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And Marx waffles on it. No, and he was dismissive of it as he was younger. But by the time you get to volumes 2 and 3 of Capital and Theories of Surplus Value, he's basically, it's too bad he died before he finished this because, Marxians might will probably jump on me for this or whatever. But those books really read to me like someone who's just it's this Kuhnian paradigm shift. Marx came across all the things that his theory had trouble with solving.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I was reading just this week is Inflation as Restructuring by Bickler and Nitzon, and one of the things they were talking about was how right near the end of Marx's lifetime was a massive change in capitalism where the population growth rate started to decline, whereas the productivity growth rate was increasing even faster. And so it kind of totally changed how capitalism worked, where prior to that point, it was ruled by captains of industry who owned factories and increased their productivity and all this stuff. And then after that, it was actually the complete opposite. It was ruled by people who are only concerned with distribution, who have no concern with the goings-on of industry, except insofar as they limit the output of industry in order to capture more of the gains, more of the revenue that comes from it. And so Veblen in 1910 or so wrote about all that stuff and how it was completely inverted from what it was before.
Yeah, the difference between business and industry.
Yep, exactly.
I love Thorstein Veblen, actually. And it's funny, he was at UChicago before UChicago became this sort of right-wing school. And
that's wild.
And actually, kind of what happened,
what if it's right-wing because he he fucked one of the professor's wives and they got so mad that they took over the school?
I think they were all doing that anyway. But actually, what is it, Rockefeller or whoever funded UChicago?
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
According to Mason Gaffney, who's the big Georgist, he wrote this book called Neoclassical Economics as a Stratagem Against Henry George. And he proposes a basically conspiratorial narrative. So, I'm always kind of skeptical of conspiracy narratives, but it's not a strong one.
But this one is real for sure.
At least the facts he enumerates are true. So it's just which is that Henry George became the best-selling political economist in the United States and the world for a while, and he almost won the mayoralty of New York, and all these people got really freaked out. So they went from so UChicago went from being Rockefeller had this idea of noble. He really wanted to leave behind this legacy where he could untarnish his name. So it was he would have a school independent of his predatory behavior. But then he was
unfortunately that didn't work. Everybody hates him now.
Yeah, he said nah, fuck it, and then he just so he went from having people like Veblen, who was a fucking radical, to hiring all these early neoclassicals who were just like, and all these like the freshwater schools as they call them, and these people were just like,
we love helicopters, etc.
Well, this is pre-helicopter, but yeah. And it's true too that the same thing about that Nathan Gaffney highlights about George and neoclassical economics is also true for human capital and Marxism. So human capital was invented as a way to explain away phenomena that Marxism explained better than neoclassical economics. In part, that's like the Cliff Notes glib version of it.
Human capital is basically just labor.
Right. It's a way to like make labor less labor.
Yeah.
Yep.
To dehumanize labor and make it a resource instead of people.
Anyway, so now we're very far from.
Yeah. So do we want to get into so what are the main reasons that central planning would not be a solution to environmental problems?
So a lot of what I just that lug tangent was actually supposed to be conversant to this. So it's just like. Yeah.
We never get off track here. We're always just talking about, the main topic.
I mean, so it's just like, we live in a society, right? I mean, so, social facts are real facts. They're not, social doesn't mean less real. Social, political, cultural, informational, epistemic facts are all still facts. So that's the first thing I want to say, which is, and same, and this holds across, whatever. So you're talking about the political possibility of nuclear power, and most people, when the advocates of it, when someone makes that argument, they say, "Oh, but by technical efficiency, it's better." Da 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 da. And it's like, okay, fine, sure, right, but do you think that the political and social and cultural stuff is just going to go away, or what do you think we're going to have an asocial rationalist society of technocrats? No one's going to have emotions and affects and cultural whatever. So that's just a general point I want to make, which is that social facts are real, epistemic facts are real, cultural facts are real, political facts are real. And they're varying degrees of robustness. So some are nigh unchangeable and some change every year. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you. Yep.
So anyway, with that first point, I want to say that outside of Twitter, okay, Marxians in the social sciences and academia don't almost never subscribe to this purist class reductionist.
Yeah, that was actually one of the weird things. Sorry, coming from grad school and then ending up on left Twitter after that, I was like, "This is night and day." Yeah, it's weird.
It's like Vertigo. So
yeah, it really is. Yeah.
And so almost no competent Marxian social science will claim that you can explain all of the facts about the world through class conflict and history or whatever. Right. I mean, that's a very rare point of view these days, because it just simply doesn't work. I mean, that's a longer conversation, but and anyway, so.
The weirder thing to me is the hatred of idealism, which just means not looking at physics or some shit like that. It's such a malleable term, but yeah.
It means whatever they want it to mean in the conversation.
Yeah. You think people think about stuff, and that's idealist.
Right. I'm anti-idealist in the sense that I do not think that cultural and intellectual ideas have causal force in history outside of their mobilization through organizational,
through power,
structures.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's, that's right. So, but if the type of person who thinks that if you just change everybody's mind, the world's gonna whatever, that's idealism. But but if you if you don't place a role for ideas, then you actually cause yourself a lot of problems. But anyway, and for information and for culture and all this other stuff. So. There's a reason that Marx is one of 5 or 6 founding fathers in sociology, for example, with Durkheim, Weber, Zimmel, Tard, Du Bois, Dewey and a few other people, and in anthropology, with like Tyler, Boas, Levi Strauss, Evans Pritchard, Malinowski.
David Graeber.
David Graeber went back in time, so, like a lot of Marxians on the internet was like, oh yeah, well that shows why they're stupid, decadent, bourgeois, or whatever. It's like, or maybe it shows that you don't actually have to be stupid to be a Marxist. Like you could read other points of view and learn about them. It's just like so. And
but also, just to be clear, you can be stupid and be Marxist. That's fine as well. It's okay to be stupid.
Everybody has the right to be stupid if they so please. But anyway, I mean, and it's funny too, is because the same thing I just said about Marx is also true for these other ones. There's no radical Durkheimians anymore. There's no radical Weberians anymore. I mean, it's just first of all, grand theory in general has sort of gone much more by the wayside, but the general understanding is that these people contributed parts of the theoretical, explanatory, causal, and interpretive puzzle, and they provided great method and discipline and subject matter. But then, other than that, we need to make new knowledge. So, with all that preface, right, there are certain properties of human social institutions and organizations and social networks and cultures and societies and enterprises and businesses and other configurations of people and in bureaucracies that these are emergent properties. They are, frankly, I mean, not just epistemically, but computationally and analytically irreducible aspects of them. So, for example, in social network analysis, there are properties of a whole network that you can't know from any of the individual components. You can only know it if you know the whole structure in the first place.
Right.
And so, the question is, to what extent do you think the metaphor of the network works for humans and human life? And I think it does very strongly because of how successful it's been as an explanatory, predictive, and technological paradigm. But so that's just one example, social networks. I mean, and then related is this conflict in economics. Because once neoclassical economics got over its obsession with just being pedantic dipshits and started focusing on the institutions and information and market design and stuff. I mean, for 25 years now, most of the stuff that economists write, not most of it, a substantial portion of it is nothing like what its critics say, either on the left or in the rest of academia. It's just I go to these ASSA conferences and they'll just be mainstream economists just being oh yeah, supply and demand don't exist. It's just it's
right.
It's and then Danny Roderick in his book, I forget which one, but he basically says that he asked them why they do this, why among themselves do they admit this, but then to the public or whatever, and and then the shit lib answer they gave was they're worried that if they go out to the public and admit that free trade isn't the greatest or whatever, then the public will go way too far in the other direction. I mean, it's a totally self-serving, elitist, whatever. But nonetheless, the fact is that within the discipline itself, it's a much more varied enterprise than it used to be. I mean, Anyway, so one idea that comes up a lot in economics, neoclassical economics, is incentive compatibility. And this is the idea that if you have an incentive system where you have institutions, to have a social system in economics in a game theoretical model or market design model or whatever, you have to have agents, well-specified norms and rules, and well-specified incentives and independence of incentives and information. And then, these can be softened, but that's sort of the basic point. But if
so just as an example of an incentive, say paying politicians more so that they don't do corrupt dealings would be one example.
Right. So the example,
just one that's been in the discourse this week.
Well, but actually, so public choice is where a lot of this stuff originated. It's politicians have several incentives. One is to like get reelected. One is to get money and power. One is to like, you know, serve whatever else interests they have. And these are incompatible incentives, right? I mean,
Probably only one of those is correct for every single politician.
Right, yeah.
no, I think all of them apply, but just, you know, one of them wins out.
Yeah.
Right.
But anyway, so like one of the greatest issues in incentive compatibility is the conflict between information gathering and enforcement. Because the problem is that if you have a hierarchy of control, and the people below you are the people collecting your on-the-ground information, and the people above you are the ones who collect information and enforce the rules, then you've just created a system where literally the best thing for the people on the bottom to do is to lie or to avoid. It's just like, I mean, like, so you have the street level bureaucrat idea with like social workers, and then, you know, cops are the evil world version of it.
Right.
And it's just like, you know, the two incentives of enforcing rules and collecting information are literally incompatible in a hierarchical bureaucracy. So that's a great example.
Yeah.
So that's like one example of incentive incompatibility. I mean, and, you know, that can be weaker or stronger, but yeah. And, you know, the one thing that dipshits always bring up is the socialist calculation debate.
Oh yeah, I've written about this. It's such horseshit.
well, okay, so it actually does make a valid point, but it doesn't. No one infers it, so no one actually, like, the thing that people take from it is wrong. But like,
so what do you think the valid point of it is? Because I think it does not make a valid point at all.
I mean, so first of all, it's just like, you know, Phil Mirowski talks about these different theorems in economics and computational economics that show that if you like modeled the economy as a computation, it would be immutable. I mean, it would just, like, you know, and like, you know, Keane talks about this stuff too, where like with a trivial number of agents and commodities, you're already getting computations that require more particles than there are in the universe, right? So it's just like
right. So my problem with that, though, is that their conclusion from that is that the price system is actually capable of doing that, which violates the Church-Turing thesis, which is that a Turing machine can accomplish any sort of computation that any other Turing machine can. And
right.
So, like, you would basically have to say that the price system is like capable of magically doing some computation that a computer isn't somehow.
Yeah, that's exactly what Mirowski's saying, is that but that's funny. But so you actually just did make that's because you just went to the point I was going to make. That's funny. So it's just like the point I was going to make. The lesson of the is the opposite of what people think it is, because the price system, or like any other system that tries to solve like a diverse set of simultaneous equations with an absurd number of parameters, is not going to work. But
right.
Especially if it's a self-referential one, because that violates the whole thing anyway. So that's another. And then the other one, which is like the idea of tacit knowledge, and that's a valid idea. Tacit knowledge, right? So, like, you know, embodied knowledge, know-how, local.
So one of the takeaways for me for the calculation problem is that we should not, like, one of the things people try to do is to try and come up with a system that could calculate, do economic calculation, whereas I think the thing is just to not bother doing that. So I think I've mentioned this before on here, but basically what you want to do is just let people take what they want up to a certain limit. And you basically produce to fulfill needs. You let people take the things that they need. You don't try to guess what it is, other than like for the first iteration of production, which is what everyone does. Like any business, if they're trying to figure out how much of something to produce, they guess how much they have to produce, and then they produce that, and then they look at how much sales there are, and then from there they figure out what they're going to do from there. and that's exactly what we should do for a decentralized planned economy. We let everyone take the things that they need, and then continue producing them based on the actual amount of stuff that people take, and you constrain it to environmental or ecological limitations.
Well, I mean, yeah, ecological limitations, that's a simple calculation, right?
Well, there's a couple models for it. There's the planetary boundaries model by Rockstrom, I think, is the main author of that one. And it sets out like 7 or 15 different like ecological measures that measure the health of the planet.
Yeah, it's a pretty persuasive one.
Yeah. And then I think also the replenishment rate thing that I was talking about earlier. I think for the period that we are trying to deal with climate change, would probably be considered a state of emergency where you can kind of violate the replenishment rates. But I think other than that, you don't want to use you don't want to extract more of something than the Earth is producing, because then you're depleting it.
So I was going to say, what you just described, I mean, there are two variants of that. Like Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner proposed a version of that, but their version used the state.
Oh, so I very recently heard of Abba Lerner. Yeah, we talked about them on our last episode.
Yeah, they're chill. And then the other one is, Robin Hahnel and Michael Albert's Paracon is.
Oh yeah, I'm not a fan.
It's very similar. It's very similar to what you just described.
Well, the problem I have with them is I don't know if they've changed this, but I've seen this many times from them, which is at the beginning of the year you write down all the things you're going to consume for the following year, and that's just like totally fucking absurd.
There does need to be some long-term planning for some production, but yeah, they said it can be up. It could be as many or as few times as you want to update the production schedules you want. Right, so it's like you're having council meetings. It doesn't really matter. That's just sort of supposed to be a heuristic around what you plan. It's not supposed to be like a.
I think the best thing to plan long term would be like the amount of base materials that you produce, and then from there you turn them into products that you need. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that just I think we should stay away from solutions right now. Just personally,
okay.
Because then we're going to get into a huge discussion. It's just, But,
right. So back to central planning.
So back to central planning, right? So wait, I was talking about so tacit knowledge is like, local knowledge, that kind of stuff. And then similar to this, though, is like interestedness, like weighting one's stake or like one's power over something based on how much it impacts them, right? So, like, the idea here is that these two pressures, like interestedness and know-how, work against each other. So you have a bunch of people who are really know-how and tacit knowledge and skilled at something, but they have a very strong vested interest in preserving their speciality of their knowledge and skewing information to be beneficial to them, right? Because it's their... And then, but conversely...
So I can give a brief aside on like a theory behind this by Olson, which is it was an attempt to establish like a grand theory of how societies grow and decline, and it was basically that redistributional coalitions, like groups of people that try to restructure society to take more of its output for themselves, are the reason that things start to get worse for the general population and like ossify and then decline subsequently, because basically
they rip the society's institutions apart from the inside.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Yep.
After a certain point, it's okay. So you keep getting ahead because that's another point I was going to. Three of the sources I linked to on that thread, I actually discussed this for the Soviet Union and for the GDR, but. The other thing that you have is people who are objective but don't know anything about the subject. So like that's kind of the and you can never solve this. You can only minimize it, right? It's the same thing with enforcement versus information collecting. These are fundamentally contradictory incentives, but you need, in theory, at least need both of them. So there's never an optimal solution. There's only just satisficing it according to, local stuff. So now we have a couple elements. Now we have social networks with autonomous properties. We have incentive compatibility and diverse contradictory incentives. There's a lot more other little esoteric things we can get into. I mean, we've already touched on them. There's computational information collection and calculation, which is just like, depending on for price system or planning, I mean, it's going to face. If anybody,
it's intractable.
It's like, or it's just it's locally tractable only. It's not it's not globally tractable for both logical and empirical reasons. And computational reasons. This is what people don't understand, is that it's not just that it's too much. It's that it's the kind of computation it's asking you to do. But anyway, so there's that one, and then there's the know-how, tacit knowledge, and interest trade-offs. So now we have 4 things, right? Information enforcement, know-how, interest, social network properties, and calculation issues, information collection, calculation, and even definition issues, right? Because you need to have shared metrics if you're going to have information. But anyway, and then similar to that, we have the problem of coordination, and whatever else you want to say about things like prisoners' dilemmas and cooperative games and so on. I mean, the fact of the matter is that as a formal model against which people can compare behavioral and computational models and lab studies, it does a very good job as showing like where it's wrong. Do you know what I mean? So it's like but what repeatedly comes out across all of this literature is that basically any based on all the behavioral evidence they have across cultures, groups of people, framings, and different rule sets or whatever, and so you're going to have some portion of the population which cheats out of self-interest, some small portion that cheats out of malice. You're going to have one small portion. You're going to have a portion that is committed out of self-interest, and then a portion that's committed out of belief or whatever. And you're going to have these different components, and this is true in the behavioral studies and the computational ones and the field ones. But what doesn't happen is non-cooperation, except if the rules are set up in such a way that they encourage that. And so then you start to get to this really interesting thing of is humanity selfish or whatever, and is humans rational? It's well, sort of, but also it really depends on the metrics, the rules, the norms, the incentives, and the information at play. And once you have those 5 things fixed, everything else is sort of fixed, right? So it's only one type of market converges to equilibrium, let alone quickly and efficiently, and it's the Dutch auction. And but it does that even when you use zero intelligence agents, which shows it has nothing to do with the properties of the individuals and entirely derives from the information, incentives, rules, and metrics. Right? It's a market. It's a longer thing. But anyway, so oh no, I'm losing my point. But I swear I had a point here. It's
so the 5 things.
Right. Yeah. Just as a general heuristic. But the thing is that what the converse isn't also true though. It's just because the naive framing is false doesn't mean the converse is true. So it's not the case that there's infinite flexibility with coordination and cooperation and information exchange. It doesn't matter how altruistic and selfless and rational or irrational your population is. There's going to become a certain point of quantitative strain on any institutional structure and any means of allocation and decision making and so on and so forth. I mean, the idea that there's no such thing as a perfect way to make decisions, I think, should be obvious, but apparently it's not. Everything has trade-offs, and the more
it's actually ranked choice voting. It's the perfect thing.
Right, exactly. And you fix them at the age of 12, and But so a lot of these things are converging on this idea of there's no globally optimal system in general. There's just many different locally ones, but that's a different point for later too. I just want to say that there's this good book I have called Managerial Dilemmas by Gary J. Miller, The Political Economy of Hierarchy. And what he talks about in this book is under conditions of hierarchy, neither command planning nor markets nor any combination thereof can maximize efficiency, let alone equity, let alone anything else. I mean, sorry, hierarchy and incomplete information. If you have those two things, which are like incomplete information.
Which you always have incomplete information.
You always have it. Always. Always. Always have asymmetric and incomplete. Always. It doesn't in transaction costs and search costs in any realistic world. And space and time issues and irreversibility and and endogeneity and correlation of information and whatever else. So like what's funny too though is the conditions under which command produces efficient outcomes planning. You can show in various theorems, and it wasn't the capitalists who showed this, it was the communists who showed this. There's an equivalent market system with a set of prices and rules that will give the same allocation as that command one. So for any situation where command works in planning theory or markets work in neoclassical theory, the other one also works. And where any one of them doesn't work, the other one doesn't work, right? So that's just like the point. And what's really interesting is that these two guys, Kantorovich and this other Koopmans, Charlie Koopmans shared the Nobel Prize. Kantorovich was a Soviet mathematician and central planning theorist. Koopmans was a neoclassical economist in Europe. They proved the same thing, right? So, I mean, it's like, and linear programming, dynamic programming, input-output analysis, statistical decision theory, operations management, sectoral allocation models, material balances planning. These were made up by a dialogue between literally capitalist corporations and military funders in the West. And
it was Rand Corp that did a lot of that, right? Yeah.
And fucking socialists and the Rand
Corp. That was actually like a third episode was about Rand Corp.
I mean, they're one of the most sinister orgs in the world, but but what's interesting though is that the original model of equilibrium, it wasn't meant to prove capitalism. It was precisely to show why socialism can work, because what they wanted to show, they were idealistic young people, and the military didn't like markets because obvious reasons, I think. And then so they hired Rand hired them, and what do they come across with which ends up becoming the Arrow-Debreu model of equilibrium? It's a planning theorem. It's not a. That's what you don't understand is that in this formalisms of equilibrium, central planning and markets are the same thing. They're not. It's like what changes is the method of allocation. Again, the norms, the information, the institutions, the incentives, the metrics, and so on. That's what changes, right? And scale and composition and all that other stuff. But anyway, so I think, in my mind, this is all related, but if you want me to show why this all comes together, I can, like, in a sort of broader way. But I think, like, if you line up each of these claims, you very quickly start to see why I am skeptical of any utopian situation, and why, like, I don't. It's just why, like, I like. There's this critique that comes from people like John Gray and so on, other people, which is basically that Soviet-style state socialism and corporate American capitalism are birds of a feather. They're not opposed, and it's not because of like some state capitalism thing. It's because they're both modernist technocratic projects that try to reduce the world to rationality and governing by these technocrats. And it's no accident they produce their models in conjunction with each other. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they are both states, and states inevitably have to, because they're big, giant hierarchies, they have to have some sort of standardization and like reduction of information from the bottom level to the bureaucrats that are in charge of decision making.
Right.
And the only difference between the two really is like what type of bureaucrat is in charge of decision making, and like what the source of legitimacy is and what the rules they go by are. And so, in either situation, like the person who's actually in charge of deciding things is not going to have the actual information of like what's happening on the ground,
or the relevant impact or self-interest.
Yeah.
So it's a vice. But there was a point you were making earlier, though, that I said I wanted to come back to. Do you remember what it was?
I'm sorry, I don't.
There's another point, which is that, bureaucracies are social networks and organizations of human beings that come together to fulfill a functional purpose. They stratify command and they distribute information and tasks, and they formalize them and standardize them. All right. Now, in order for that to work whatever, if you take all the stuff I just said together, right, a couple things follow. First of all, a bureaucracy that doesn't formalize itself and make itself like a self-perpetuating enclosed organization is just going to it's going to rip itself at the seams through the different factional interests, which is why you need some degree of
I see, yeah. Oh, you're probably thinking of the redistributional coalitions thing?
Yes, and what the point I wanted to do with that one is I'll make later, but the point is that for a bureaucracy to serve a function well, it needs to have a degree of non-functionality. It needs to prevent itself from being destroyed. And even if it didn't do that, though, that's the natural tendency. Now, there's many reasons I can show why this is true. I can show you there's dozens of ways you can come to the same conclusion I just said, but including the previous elements I just said. But more importantly, it's the salve that ties together all those previous things, because now you start to realize that self-perpetuation is an emergent property of the social network properties and organizational properties of bureaucracy, even if they're maximally efficient and designed to serve a function. And they're never going to solve, they're only going to minimize and satisfy the impact, interest, know-how, interest, information enforcement, inside, outside, local, global, computational. And anyway, so that's just a general point. Even before centralization, this is why both markets and central planning fail in practice. Anyway, that's why we can stop there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's like the social science sort of broad observation in societies generally that I've just observed in a more kind of and read about and heard about in the more kind of like the microcosm of political organizing, where if you want to get something super stable, fucking DNC shit, then you end up with that, but it's full of fucking Democrats, for example, right? And then and so it's stable and it goes in a direction, but the direction is not necessarily good. And it's run by, like you said, a bunch of fucking dipshits. And but then if you want something that's more like the IWW, where it's let's we can have rules and stuff. Let's not be too formal, and we'll just kind of go by the seat of our pants for the most part. Then the IWW is in a constant state of turmoil and collapse, from what I've heard. And I can definitely attest to that in my experience here. Even though, and so it's well, of course they're fucking burning out. They're always at odds with each other, and the energy goes nowhere, and it's really frustrating to watch.
Yeah, it's a weird dialectic between, wanting to do anarchism and needing to confront a centralized hierarchy.
Exactly. And the, I mean, it's sort of part and parcel with the rest of the conversation, but much of it does have to do with the management of resources and labor, and so it's just very interesting to, from the more kind of anarchist, the IWW style stuff, you're seeing I'm seeing a lot of in DC anyway, the really granular specific stuff, a lot of talking about the stuff that's out there, and then not necessarily getting involved with it, or getting involved with one thing, and then it either just kind of rides on its own momentum because it becomes a little formalized, or it completely breaks down almost immediately because it doesn't formalize. Or if they try to formalize it, then somebody brings up like some fucking objection, and it just all just falls apart, right? Because like you can't even get it to the point of formalization. So, so that's and then at the same time, like you said, like if you're confronting centralized power and you're not able to create a stable structure, then you're not really confronting it. Really, you're just sort of making noise, unfortunately. So it's I think this is actually one reason why I like the MLs are MLs is because they recognize that paradox or that issue. But
I see where they're coming from.
Yeah, I totally see where they're coming from, right? Yeah, it's just that, like, it doesn't mean that they don't have problems too, right?
Right.
So, like, well, okay, so you picked a team in terms of like this paradox, but it's still a fucking paradox, So you chose dipshits over chaos, and I guess that's just how it's going to be for you,
Yeah. And of course, we want to abolish the state immediately with no concern about imperialism. So that's our big problem.
right, exactly. Yeah. We just, as anarchists, we don't read books. We don't do anything important.
All right, so I don't want to literally start over, but I realized as I just sent you the messages that I'm making this harder for myself than I have to.
Okay.
Because what I was just doing was giving effective. I was actually leading up to something more general, which is a generalized critique of markets, bureaucracies, states, planning, and hierarchy and centralization, and all that stuff.
That's what this show's all about.
Yeah, well, right. But the specific thing for the ecological issue is actually much simpler for me to make.
Okay.
So all the stuff I said before is relevant, but the simple first thing that's just like important to notice is that the costs and constraints of time, space, information, classification, metrics, enforcement, coordination, and self-perpetuation are a function of the size of an organization, its complexity, its diversity, its stratification, its hierarchy, and its incentive structure. Okay, it's not a linear relation because there's some economies of scale and scope, but it's pretty whatever. The next point is that if due to the nature of coordination of factions of the interest and know-how issue and the enforcement issue, if a social network and organization doesn't provide for its self-perpetuation, it'll rip itself apart. Which is why, ironically enough, as I was saying, bureaucracies need to institutionalize a kind of level of inefficiency, basically perpetuating themselves irrespective of their task, or else they just can't work at all. So it's like at least over a long period of time. They can work for a small local area for a little period of time. And then once you start to get to different bureaucracies interacting, which each have different metrics, norms, locations, information, and so on, and then you just start to get to this absurdly complex problem that's not even empirical; it's actually formal because like mixing metric systems, like unless you have like a meta logic in which you can sort of translate everything. The best you're going to get is something like the equivalent of like an algorithmic pigeon, for lack of a better word. But
like a standardized protocol sort of thing.
Yeah, and then but the more standardized and universalized your protocol is, the less robust it is, the less localist conditions. So it's always trade-offs, and I mean, it's just always trade-offs. There's no perfect system, especially not
except for TCP, which is perfect.
Okay. It's funny. There's a really good book called Protocol by I think the guy's name is it's Alexander Galloway. Great book.
Okay.
He argues it's called How Control Exists After Decentralization, and his point is that the internet is not this decentralized paradise of rhizomatic networks or whatever. But anyway,
that sounds cool.
So that's just like that's a function of that stuff, and that's a generalized critique of planning and bureaucracy. But there's also a few other issues. So first of all, like centralization and hierarchy are very good at expanding their share of power and perpetuating themselves and growing, which is like because the more because they start to get like because of fixed costs due to time and space and energy and land and coordination and so on, the more they grow, like the more relative their like efficiency is over their cost. Now, one could hear this and say, "Oh, that sounds great. That means we should have large groups." But fact of the matter is that actually what that does is it skews their it skews their relative marginal costs of resources, because it makes fixed depleting and deteriorating resources cheaper for them relative to other ones. And bureaucracies and so on have, let's say you're a specialist who knows something really specific and complex, like nuclear or whatever, or you have a secret list of connections to a bunch of other people that you use for brokerage, or your firm just figured out how to make a new way of producing something. You don't want that information to get out because it lowers your relative advantage, even if you're and not only that, but it actually, by inducing competition outside of you, even if you're not doing it for selfish motives, it's going to make it harder for you to do your job. So there's a tendency towards like the confinement of information and knowledge and skills and resources that's concomitant with this. So you get the artificial cheapening of fixed deteriorating stock resources, and you get the artificial inflation of costs of general specialized knowledge resources. And that's literally the word, because that means that you're incentivizing things which are fixed and rival and excludable and deteriorate, and disincentivizing those which don't. Anyway, there's also the fact that, as just a simple fact, the larger, the more hierarchical, more centralized, and more complex an organization is, the more centralized and technological, social, logistical, and ecological infrastructure it's going to require. This is just very straightforward. I mean, it's not a linear relationship, but it is a relationship, and it's a real one.
Have you read Blair Fix's work on hierarchical organization and energy use?
No, who's it?
Blair Fix. I'll give you his ad on Twitter later. But basically, his thesis is that by the laws of thermodynamics, because hierarchies are an organized structure, they require continuous energy input, and the larger it gets, the more energy input it requires. And
it's non-linear. It needs constantly growing energy things, and that was my next point that I wanted to make, which is that's true. Even you can think of this as a very on a social level, because the larger you get, the more your factions, the more specialized you're going to get, the more pressure there's going to be on resource distribution, which means you need ever accelerating resources to distribute to your cronies. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And we have seen this empirically hold in every bureaucracy in history. I don't care what you say. And it doesn't matter how noble and high-minded they are. Right. So you talked about this thing of being ripped apart at the seams. There's just a couple good books. One's called Subversive Institutions. One's called Political Epistemics. And one's by this guy, Vladimir Popov, which I think is a really important book to this subject here. And they talk about how the Soviet Union was not an economic failure, because actually transactional efficiency of their firms was the same as European. It was political. Their faction,
and they won the space race.
Well, right. But so they had a highly centralized planning system and bureaucracy, but then, as is wont to happen, this led to factionalization and capture by different interest groups, namely the specialists, the technocrats, the military, the diplomatic and foreign service, and like advocates for the workers or whatever. And once Soviet growth started to decline, this literally just ripped it apart at the seams, obviously accelerated by corruption, crime, foreign malfeasance, and the policies of people like Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But the general point holds. And it's also interesting because that was the reason it got ripped apart. But the reason that growth started to slow in the Soviet Union in the first place was actually because of this stuff too. Because, as I was saying, they had an incentive towards high throughput, centralized stock investment, and less towards to services, knowledge, low capital, and so on and so forth. And that was great when what they wanted to do was rapidly create a coal stocks, oil stocks, pig iron, and so on and so forth, and to produce military equipment, and even to organize things like education and healthcare, because there you just you give resources and then you let the specialists do it themselves in the local area. But the problem is that exhausts itself once there is no longer marginal returns on adding more shit to your system. So once just adding energy and raw materials to your system is no longer is marginally beneficial, the growth is going to slow down. And the Soviets themselves and the planning theorists themselves noticed this. And actually, interestingly, Khrushchev noticed it and tried to reform the economy. And he always gets hated on by MLs, but per capita income growth was the highest under Khrushchev of any of them. And then Brezhnev ossified the system and brought it back. And a great book on that is it's called Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. But the other thing is that because of the nature of information, of classifying, sorting, and allocating, the bigger and more hierarchical and less locally specified and more high throughput an organization is, the more it's going to be, it's computationally, informationally, and materially cheaper for them to allocate, extract, enclose, and distribute standardizable, fixed commodity stocks of things, pig iron, widgets, coal, oil. But when you start to deal with non-quantifiable things like, carbon emissions it's not the same kind of quantifiable. CO2 emissions, ecological stocks and sinks.
Stuff that you have to limit instead of maximize.
Well, that's true too, but also they're diffuse, they're hard to calculate, and they're hard to
okay.
And so things like science, art, organization, literature, the professions, CO2 emission reduction, computerization, so on and so forth, those become difficult and more difficult. And actually, there's a great book on Soviet cybernetics called it's not the one that everybody reads about, Cybersyn. This is in the Soviet Union. There was this they tried to do their own. It's called From Newspeak to Cyberspeak. And he talks about how the internal structural system of the Soviet Union, despite having the best educated and the best cyberneticists in the world, it totally failed. And America's ARPANET did really well, but there's a really good book on that, The Entrepreneurial State by Matty B. But this book by Garovich, From Newspeak to Cyberspeak, it totally failed in the Soviet Union. And actually the Cybersyn people who mixed decentralization, localization, and centralization, and effectively invented the internet ahead of time, tried to tell the Soviets, no, you can't do it this way. Stafford Beer tried to reach out to them, no, it's a separate story, but to decentralize, you need to decentralize it. They just didn't listen because they didn't want to lose the informational and logistical and infrastructural control. So there's that show, right? So we have the artificial cheapening of fixed stocks of resources and the artificial making expensive of services, goods, information. We have the tendency towards easy to classify, easy to grow, easy to accumulate resources, disincentive against services, diverse goods, local stuff, intellectual stuff. You have the competing issues of factionalization of and ever needing resource stocks. You have the fact that if you're centralized, you literally need a centralized technological, material, energetic, and ecological infrastructure, and that needs to be continually growing. Is
this problem the? Oh, go ahead.
I just try because I'm trying to tie it all together. It's a snappy quote. So,
no problem.
And so you have the information enforcement issues. You have the interest issues. You have the specialization stuff, the ghettoization thing. You have the fact that it's very good at accumulating stocks of resources, but the more it does that, the higher rate at which it needs to extract resources to keep the same level of growth, especially because you start to get diseconomies of scale from storage and extraction and enclosure and protection and logistics. So all of these pressures together, which we have seen operate in every bureaucracy in history to varying degrees, and the Popov book does a really great comparative study of that. This makes central planning and centralized bureaucracies totally inimical to the kinds of things that are necessary for a transition to an ecological economy. It requires throughput growth. It requires throughput stocks. It requires enclosure. It requires extraction. It requires surveillance. It requires standardized widgets of goods. It requires deprioritizing non-rival, non-excludable intellectual goods and extra priority.
All the things that a state needs, essentially.
Exactly, and that's James Scott's Seeing Like a State is another great discussion of this. So all of the points I just made, those can actually be made independently of all the stuff I said in the first half. But I think it should be clear that they do go together, because the two sets of dynamics, just like it means that you're setting yourself up for a system which is either going to collapse or which is going to self-perpetuatingly, grow itself, or both. But it's not, it's not going to work for what we need to do, which is that the biggest problem in the world right now is overproduction, misproduction, and misallocation. So capacity utilization is at 80% globally, labor force participation is at 60%, and urban land use is like 40%, but non-urban land use is like 500% over. It's one of the 9 planetary boundaries.
Yeah.
So we have a thing where, what do we have? We have the artificial restriction and enclosure of intellectual, social, human, scientific, cultural, network, informational goods, and the artificial cheapening and use of land, energy, ecological stocks, and sinks. We have mass overproduction of all primary products. We have mass overuse and misuse of land. We have our economy is overly capitalized. 40% of people don't even need to work for the system to maintain itself. We produce basically every good and commodity at least like 3 times as much as we need to, but then we artificially restrict access to it. So, we have
one of my favorite stats is that 99% of all industrial products are waste within 6 weeks, and this was as of like 1991.
Yeah,
and 80% of products are only made to be used one time.
Right, and what is it like? We produce 3 times as much food as is needed, but that also understates it, because there's food stocks, there's massive food waste at both the production point and distribution, and most agriculture isn't for food. It's for industry. and if America didn't subsidize its agriculture through land subsidies, interest rate subsidies, water subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, and protectionism, America would literally just not produce food except in like urban gardens and decentralized plots.
Yeah, we would all starve to death.
Well, no, we wouldn't do that. We would just get cheaper, higher quality food from other people who are better at growing it.
Okay.
It's just I
kind of think that people have been de-skilled enough that we would not be able to produce enough food if they weren't paying the central producers to, have all these command over these giant hierarchies to force other workers to do the same thing.
Well, history shows that when humans are de-skilled with regards to agriculture and then they need to relearn it, they're actually very good at doing so.
Oh, okay. That's good news.
Yeah, people are pretty quick with that one, yeah.
I mean,
that's good.
It's not like it's not going to happen overnight. It would be, if we snapped our fingers, a lot of people would die, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if
we wouldn't save everyone, but we wouldn't lose everyone either.
Right. Mm-hmm. But even in the Soviet Union, though, they by the 50s and 60s, they had a shit ton of garden plots throughout all of their cities. They had all these urban people going back to agriculture for their own home production, and they ended up with a decentralized agricultural system on top of their centralized one anyway. In Cuba, that was like relearning, because they were importing most food and energy, and then they just couldn't do so anymore. And then all these farmers on their plots of land were just like, oh, well, then we're just going to go back to the techniques we used before we were forced to do centralized production and high stock use and petroleum-based agriculture. And then the state afterwards, they did some coordination and diffusion of these techniques, but they took credit for socialism, but was effectively just the return to pre-existing
non-state living.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
we see this with agriculture a lot, and I mean, it's just like so. I don't know.
So I gotta ask. So this thing that you were talking about with the Soviet Union growing really rapidly and being able to produce basic resources, but then getting to a point where they were overproducing. Yeah. So what do you think that's akin to the point around the late 19th century where productivity continued to grow, but population growth declined, where basically it was the demand for resources stopped growing And so they came to this crisis of like our whole system was geared around the demand for resources continually growing and us being able to satisfy that, and now we have to do something else. Is that what the problem was?
Well, it was more a problem of misallocation. So they were overproducing in one area and underproducing in the other. So eventually productivity started to decline. Not absolute productivity, like the transactional efficiency of firm was still, if you add 10 units of energy, you get 10 whatever of output. But it's like, but productivity growth started to stagnate, and they couldn't support the ever-growing burdens of the Soviet state. I mean, it was just
I got you. Okay.
Like, you know, J.K. Galbraith came to the Soviet Union as an advisor, and he was like, look, if you wanted to solve your problem overnight, he's like, well, all you have to do is like legalize like private industry and petty services and commerce.
Legalize it.
Consumer goods. And then effectively like lower everybody's real wage by like tripling the price of consumer goods. And he's like, within a year, you'll have all your rationing and hoarding issues over, and your economy will switch over.
That's cool. I love rationing.
But like, there's no way they could do that because there would be riots, right? If everybody fell by 66%, I mean, it was just so. That was they could have done a slow transition to that in the 60s, but by the time they were in the 80s, the fixed costs and scrap costs were so high, it was impossible, which is ironically why Russia and the former Soviet states did, like, for their capitalists at least, did so well in capitalism, because they had a shit ton of it oversupplied heavy capital. And then once they were on a global market, it became marginally efficient again, but they bought it at fire sale prices. So they effectively just like dumped a shit ton of capital on the rest of the world and then used the proceeds to buy whatever consumer goods they wanted because they could do so now. And they just billionaires. I mean, so it's just like it's ironically good for building billionaires. It's not so, as China shows, but it's not so good for, these other purposes. And there's a not a Soviet, but a socialist planning textbook by Michael Ellman. It's in its like third or fourth edition now. And he talks about a lot of this stuff. I mean, the Soviet system was really good at the military. It was really good at primary products, and it was really good at extraction and throughput and land-intensive production. And it was good at some things like urbanization, education, literacy, and health. But it wasn't good at consumer goods, petty goods and services, environmental things, cybernetics, decentralized things, situation-specific stuff, non-heavy throughput production, transition, stability, and so on. Right? So it's like, yeah, and so
that's really interesting.
And then there's one other book. I'm forgetting the Michael Ellman book, and then Robert Putnam's From Farm to Factory, which all the MLs cite, which is funny because in that book he literally talks about how like it was like a pretty amazing breakneck industrialization, but it was because the transition they were doing to like the kind of production they were doing was not like easy, but relatively straightforward. And all they had a massively oversupplied labor force and all this uncultivated land and all this stuff. And so they literally just basically dispossessed the peasantry and then said, all right, take as much shit as you can out of the ground as possible and put it in these areas. And that's what the Magnetic Mountain book is also about. But also, interestingly enough, Kotkin talks about in the second Stalin biography, he talks about how the dispossession of the peasantry actually led to a decline in available surplus for industrialization. So the typical narrative that goes that he had to dispossess the peasantry to industrialize, at least in terms of surplus, is wrong. It did produce excess labor and a free urbanized labor force, which they used, but actually they got more surplus credit for industrialization from foreign trade and foreign credit than they did from dispossessing the peasantry. So,
so I know that our other co-host Peter would want me to ask you: have you ever heard of the concept of adhocracy?
No.
It's basically the idea that it's sort of like a bureaucracy, but rather than being a persistent organization, it would be an organization that's formed to do a specific task and then dissolves as soon as it's done.
Right. and that's the ideal system. But what we see is that's obviously like what we'd want if we wanted that. But so far, I mean, what we see from incorporation and from the church and from early settlements and these big, joint stock companies is like they don't just go away.
Right.
Especially
they find the reasons for existing at the very least.
What?
I said they ride on their momentum, but they find other reasons for existing, basically.
Exactly. And that's what I was saying here. In order for bureaucracy to be efficient, they actually ironically have to do that, or else they'll get ripped apart.
Right.
Now, there's one exception to this, though, and it's the idea, like, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It's like, if you institutionalize a means to, like, shut down, like, an organization like that, like, once its task is complete from the outside, then you actually could do it, but then you have to deal with the problem of what happens to that enforcer, because who watches it or whatever. So, but I've often had this idea of, like I was trying like temporary liminal like state-like entities was the term I came up with for it, and it would be like if there's an asteroid coming towards the Earth or a meteor heading towards the Earth, like I'm not gonna moan and clutch pearls about establishing a hierarchy to stop it if that's what will do it. So I mean, but I don't want it to persist. So what do? We figure out a way, but the problem is like I don't know if this would work. It's just like I don't know. So
you stop the meteor, and then what do you do about future meteors? You need to keep the bureaucracy around to make sure that the future meteors can be stopped.
That's what they'll say. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for things like meteors, the space program, climate change, I think that these are okay. But the problem is that hierarchies based on merit and talent and expertise aren't very stable, because they require people who are more experienced, better, more competent, and whatever to rise above each other. But that's
it's like there's less replaceability among the members. I think the thing that makes it stable is if like de-skilling is really the thing. Like a hierarchy is very stable if any part is replaceable. So if someone decides to like be a human for once and do something normal, then you have to replace them. And you have to do that with someone who has the equivalent ability of the person you're replacing. And so like in order to do that, it has to be either de-skilled, or there needs to be standard information that they get, or what have you. Does that make sense?
Yes, and more open access to information, skills, knowledge, whatever. But as
have you read Lewis Mumford?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Like the mega machine concept, basically.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. That's a lot of this. My thought is influenced by that. Ivan Illich and Lewis Mumford and Bookchin, obviously, and and James Scott, and I love all these people. But I mean, they're just really smart. But Jane Jacobs.
So we're getting pretty far along. So let's just for the last little bit talk about someone that we both hate. Matt Brunig.
Okay, I think I can even connect that to
perfect. Yeah.
I feel bad because the first half I rambled and I was interested in what I was talking about, but I just very quickly summarized the main argument in a much simpler way in the second half. Anyway, hopefully the two work together in the recording, but
it'll be great, I think.
Matt Brunig is an insufferable dipshit.
Agreed.
He literally exemplifies the most obnoxious, pedantic, socially inept form of actually fucking debate club dude there is. Every single one of his proposals depends on the presumption of it already having been successful to work in the first place. So it's like if we had enough power that our unions could bargain for a better managerial standard of hiring and firing, then we could have this like computational system. But it's like, but if you had it, you wouldn't need it in the first place. It was
exactly.
You already have sufficient power to do that. You don't need the fucking it's just like
yeah. And then so my favorite one of his is the sovereign wealth fund idea, which is we're going to create a basic income and also avoid inflation by not issuing money, which is, of course, impossible to do because MMT is bullshit, according to him. metalism is the correct thing. And the way that we do that, the way that we avoid inflation and redistribute wealth is by buying stocks from rich people, buying stocks and assets, and paying people dividends based off of the gain in asset prices, which of course is not inflation at all.
I mean, what's funny about that is that it's only like, in order for it to not be inflation, you'd have to assume you have a competitive, perfect market economy, which a presumption of his argument is that doesn't exist. So it's kind of funny.
I mean, I would argue that in order to have any dividends, you have to have asset price inflation, because otherwise, what are you gaining? If the price of the asset stays the same, then you can't pay any dividends.
No, well, but that's the point, is that in a perfect market, efficient market, in a construct thereof, those asset price increases will reflect actual productivity increases. But of course,
right. Oh yeah, okay, that's what you're saying.
In a world that doesn't exist, that's a myth that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
in a world where a machine can absorb carbon from the atmosphere.
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. And that one was one of those fucking.
Oh my god.
Like okay, so just whatever. If people don't know about this, Matt Bruinig. Okay, he said, he made this argument for geoengineering, and the way his argument was like, oh, you support reforestation, and that's engineering. Humans have always engineered the climate, and it's like, look,
which has always worked out really well.
Reforestation or whatever, but the idea is like this. It's like, look, that's clearly not how people mean geoengineering.
Yeah, exactly.
And our opposition to geoengineering isn't because it's called geoengineering and because it fits some formal analytic criteria. It's because of the specifics of it. And so if reforestation is a form of climate engineering, then all I would say is, okay, then there are some geoengineering I support and some I don't.
Yeah.
All you have to say to that. But, he tries to make it like this principled argument, but no one's opposition to geoengineering is principled. I mean, sometimes it's aesthetic.
He's a ceteris paribus nerd.
Yeah, but he doesn't actually ceteris paribus. He requires an obscene number of extraneous assumptions to make his idea work at all. And so he tried to claim then that geoengineering was better because if you had a hypothetical carbon-sucking machine, whatever. And it was like, and as me and everyone else said, if we had a fucking 100% efficient hypothetical carbon machine, then yes, we would support it. It's just but that doesn't exist. It won't exist because it's an impossibility. Mm-hmm. And if we divert resources to trying to find it, that's a waste of resources.
Exactly.
When we have a great carbon sucking machine as it is, it's called fucking trees. And then he tried to argue that trees take up more land and therefore are not as good as a carbon sucking.
He said the only reason that people like them is aesthetics.
Because he's never seen a tree in his life.
Yeah.
But what's funny, though, is that the ecological people have done this, and it's actually the opposite, is that any sufficient machine for sequestering and extracting carbon would actually just need to be as big as the industrial capacity that we have. Yep. So it's actually the opposite of what he said. But anyway.
Yeah.
He said, so he said the aesthetic thing, that people who support it just because of it, and it's such projection because it's clear that his thing is that he likes high technology. And and it's an aestheticism for him. I don't care. I don't care what it looks like. And we all said, look, if your machine existed, we would support it. So it doesn't work. And but
also trees do look better than machines, just to set the record straight.
Yes. Generally,
they're each have their own aesthetic in their own way. I don't see it's just but and then the other thing though is that he said, someone was like, oh, because without reforestation, you get desertification or whatever. And he's like, well, animals live in deserts too. Why are they? Why are they not as good as the other ones? It's like, you stupid.
Think of the turtles.
Maybe we should put Matt in a desert and see how he feels about it.
Yeah, about its wonderful desert ecology. But I mean, desert ecologies are great. But you don't want them to cover the fucking entire surface mass of the planet.
Yeah.
And then what else did he say? That was just it was just
the thing about machines firing people.
Oh yeah. No, but on the geoengineering thing, the last thing I was saying is that the whole thing was that look, we need to do climate change stuff now. And
Yes.
we had to do it now. We have a solution now. It's reforestation. If you want to call that geoengineering, then fine. We support a kind of geoengineering.
Yeah.
But we can't wait for a future hypothetical machine, especially one that we know to be impossible, especially when we have an available opportunity right now. And again, it goes to this idea of where my whole point about we don't want to lock ourselves into these big technological, socio-technical infrastructures because of their high fixed costs, their high scrap costs, their contingency and their path dependence and their centralization, when we could do the opposite and reduce waste and resource use and so on. And then we have free resources to experiment with other things. And I think that's a very important point. It actually ties the Brunick thing to the geoengineering thing, to the central planning thing, to the ecological issue thing, to all.
And then also with the de-skilling thing, lots of people can plant trees, and no one can build a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere.
Exactly. And degrowth, waste reduction, and refabrication and refurbishment is labor intensive, but not skilled, or at least not hard to acquire skills.
Yeah.
So everybody can plant, everybody can insulate. Not everybody, but you know what I mean. Like it's like very.
And if anyone does have the skills to plant trees, DM me so that I know how to do it, because I'm trying to be a tree planting guy now.
And then it's just. And
done with politics. I'm going to be a tree planting guy.
You know, it's like if fucking if during Obama, right, if he had had the chutzpah to have been like if he had his response to the financial crisis,
we should plant trees.
Well, but literally though, if his response to the financial crisis was, I'm going to dump like $3 trillion worth of fiat money into the economy and direct it all towards infrastructure refurbishment, reforestation, green energy, waste reduction. We'd still have
rich people.
Right. We would still have the ecological crisis, but that was actually a transition point that would have been pretty effective. I mean, it wouldn't have saved us. John Bellamy Foster has a thing he calls it like a capitalism and degrowth and impossibility theorem. He pretty convincingly argues they're completely incompatible.
I agree with that for sure. I won't get into it, but
I think they're incompatible for the same reason I think that central planning is not viable in the long run for solving climate crisis. But there is actually one thing I want to say too about that, which is I was taking to live in the DMs or whatever, and what I said was because basically I said, look, states are incompatible with this, and she asked so does that mean states are incompatible with survival of the human race? And I said yes, and she said so we have to somehow have to abolish states in the next 11 years, and I understand why that was the go-to, but I wouldn't. That's not my answer. Because my answer is not that I'm a fucking megalomaniacal central planner who snaps my fingers and abolishes the state. That abolishing the state in the military is going to be a fucking long ass process that we're going to lose.
So difficult.
That we're going to lose a lot of the time and regroup and then go again. It's not like we're going to fucking do it overnight.
Exactly.
And then also, I think we've mentioned this on the show before, but if you abolish the state tomorrow, millions of people would die.
Nobody knows what the fuck to do with themselves.
I don't know if millions of people would die, but there would be a massive decline in living standards for a brief period.
Yeah, I mean, people depend on the state to provide them with food and shelter and all this kind of stuff, and
bureaucrats
without instantly reconfiguring supply chains or coming up with new ones to supply people with food and shelter and all that basic shit. That people would definitely die.
Well, what we'd find actually is that the rural areas would bounce back very quickly.
But that's a minority. That's a tiny minority of human society right now.
And actually, I was going to say, and the coastal urban areas.
Okay.
The people who would get fucked are the suburbs,
Midwest,
and Midwest. Yes.
So me.
I mean, me too. But it's just, but even that still, though, I don't know. I just there would, because professionals, bureaucrats, technocrats, military people, arms insurance, finance, they all literally depend on the state for their real estate. They all depend on the state. Exactly. But at the same time, though, am I really going to shed a tear if all of a sudden they have the rug pulled out from under them? But anyway.
But also, even if you take historical examples, I think those historical examples happen in the context where there wasn't massive ecosystem collapse happening all around, where maybe people could bounce back because there was an ecosystem to support them, whereas now there's not as much of that.
So what Jared Diamond in his class book doesn't seem to understand is that the big variable isn't overhang of ecology due to civilization. It's due to what I call forced settlement. It's that if you can't fucking leave an area, then all of his examples of societies that collapsed were in islands, in mountain valleys, in
that's a good point. Damn.
In peninsulas, they were all surrounded. And as James Scott points out in Against the Grain, is that actually, if you look at these so-called collapses, the population in the city went down, but it rose everywhere else, which just means the people just left. And they didn't.
I was actually going to bring that up, by the way. But yeah, like deurbanization essentially is how you get through that.
Yeah, and like a lot of the tribes that we encounter in Amazonia, who we say, oh, these uncontacted lost tribes. A lot of them are actually people who are in these Mesoamerican empires who, after the collapse, when the king or whatever gets killed, they just like looked around and like, oh fuck, dude, let's make a run for it now before they get to us. And they ran into the fucking jungle, and they just were like, great, now we get the left. And then Jim Scott talks about this in the Zomia, the same concept in the upland Southeast Asia. And these people go up there and they like voluntarily learn to stop reading. And so then the Chinese census taker comes up there, a bureaucrat, and they, sorry, we can't read. But it's just, I don't know. So the big thing for me is migration, freedom of movement. But as Cuba showed, even that can be circumvented if you have favorable conditions. Mm-hmm. However, Cuba's not the miracle everybody thinks it is. They now import 80% of their food and energy anyway again. So it's just like whatever. But anyway, yeah.
I think that's a good place to close out. We're going pretty long, but yeah, I think we covered a lot of really great stuff.
Okay, I hope this wasn't the too wordy one.
Oh no, it was great. I think we'd love to have you on again in the future. Yeah, everything was very interesting. So, if you enjoyed that, check out our other episodes. You can find our podcast at neighborsciencepodcast.com. I almost said Post Scarcity Magazine, but I didn't. I always do that. Our Twitter is at NeighborSciPod. I am at Handle of Rye. Chris is at Solidarity_Goth. yungneocon is at yungneocon.
With a Y.
Yes.
With the U. I mean.
U-N-G. Yes.
Do you have anything you want to plug or
me?
Like
well, check out my sound. No, I don't have anything. Do y'all want me to like post? Do you have a place you could post links to like books and stuff that people might want?
Yeah. So I wrote down like 8 of the books that you've mentioned so far. Probably only like that's probably only covering like a third of them. But
well, I have
I usually put some in the show description. So if you wanna like DM me the books, I'll put them all in the show notes.
Great.
Yeah. So check out books. And yeah. Thanks everyone. And thanks Young Neocon.
Have a good night.
Yeah. Bye.